Okay, so to give you kind of an intro to Unit 10, it is personality theory. It seems kind of weird to start with Freud and the psychodynamic theorists for personality theory, but it'll make sense in a minute. I'm going to try to tie in as much of the vocab as I can. Some of these tests, like the personality test, will come from different sections or different modules, but I think they apply here, and also it's an excuse for me to give them to you in context so you can hopefully get them right on the quiz. But one of the things I want to start with is this idea of psychodynamic theory when it comes to personality. So if we're looking at personality, we have to look at it as it's defined, we have to look at it as it's measured, we have to look at personality tests and what they are. But we're going to start with kind of the origins of psychodynamic theory. So the psychodynamists, let's call them psychoanalysts. The psychoanalysts would be starting with Freud, and then you have several neo-Freudians like Alfred Adler, Carl Jung, and even people like Viktor Frankl. But let's start with the three sort of largest contributors that are known as like the Viennese from Vienna, right? The Viennese school of psychodynamics. In chronological order would be Sigmund Freud, Carl Jung, and Viktor Frankl. So Freud we'll get into extensively today, so I'm going to hold off on talking about Freud at just this second. We'll get into his theory in just a minute. But it's worth noting some context here. Let me give you some historical context. As you can see, Freud was born in 1856. He was Austrian born. When he went to college, he decided to study really human biology. He wanted to study medicine. He became a medical doctor. That's one of the questions that you get at the beginning of the study guide. It's also on your test. But you'll read about that in the book. Freud was a medical doctor in the traditional sense. Family practice medicine, diagnosing illnesses, prescribing medicine, etc. What really shifted his course away from traditional medicine into psychiatry was this increasing distress he was noticing in his patients. And to give you a little background on this, in the post-World War I years, right, obviously Germany, Austrian troops who were part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire were all part of this conflict. And so you see a bunch of people coming back from war in 1917, 1918, 1919, and this is kind of at the height of Sigmund Freud's medical practice. So Freud is practicing medicine. He's seeing an increasing number of his patients that are military veterans, and they're having massive amounts of psychological trauma. Now, they did understand psychological trauma somewhat from warfare, but they called it shell shock. They really didn't have a comprehension of post-traumatic stress like we do now. But it was troubling to Freud, but it was also kind of, it was interesting to him to try to figure out, okay, so what causes this? How do we treat it? So one of the things we should probably mention about Freud is that even when he switches from traditional medicine to psychiatry, Freud was not one of these people who was trying to contribute to psychology as a field academically, so to speak. Most of Freud's theory came from his medical practice. So very much from the beginning, what his focus and interest was in treating his clinical patients. So a lot of times Freud catches some flack when we look back on him now. It's kind of become like an anecdote of psychology majors, you know, like Freudian topics and theories. It's almost like a joke. But to be fair to Freud, most of his theories were hindsight bias. That's fair criticism. But he wasn't really trying to find a predictive diagnostic, if that makes sense. Like Freud's goal wasn't to contribute to the understanding of the brain so that he would find his legacy in the psychology field. Now, Freud was very much interested in helping his clinical patients. So he was a clinician. Freud pioneered this idea of psychoanalysis. He became the first free association, or like couch psychiatrist. We'll look at the idea that the patient is not sitting in a chair, the patient is laying comfortably in a setting facing away from their therapist, not at their therapist. And this is very much a part of his his medical practice, his clinical practice. So we'll get into Freud and what he believed and how this theory came about, which really is difficult to palate. You have to really kind of comprehend what Freud believed. It's very, very, very deep theological stuff. It's very theoretical. It might be kind of difficult for you to look at that or listen to that and say, okay, yeah, that's not something I buy into. So you have to kind of take Freud with an open mind until you can really kind of process what it is that he was theorizing, and then you can at least appreciate the genius in it, even if it's not something that's medically or scientifically accurate. But then we get into Carl Jung. We'll look at Carl Jung a little bit later on. Carl Jung is a neo-Freudian who was, I think he was Swiss-born. He gets credit as being in the field of Viennese psychiatry because he was very much influenced by Freud. In fact, he had a working relationship with Freud, but you can see, so Freud was 1856 and died in 1939. Carl Jung wasn't born until almost 20 years later in 1875. So by the time Jung was about 30-ish, somewhere in there, and he began his own medical practice, he was very much interested in sexual motivation like Freud was. So he wrote this, essentially a thesis, and he sent it to Freud because he wanted Dr. Freud to read it. And so they strike up this dialogue, and they start writing back and forth, and at one point they meet, and they start working together. So Jung was very much a neo-Freudian. Even if they weren't close personal companions, they had a lot of overlap in their theory. So Carl Jung was very much influenced by Freud. But there were some very significant differences. In fact, of the neo-Freudians, being post, after, or new, right? After Freud's original theory, there were people that took pieces of his theory and rejected other pieces of his theory. So most of the neo-Freudians are similar in this way. They reject the idea of sexuality developing, gender and sexuality developing in childhood, right? In fact, it's not even so much that Carl Jung probably rejected the idea that you develop gender and identity roles and your sexuality as a child, but Jung probably didn't feel like it impacted the adult person at the same level that Freud did. Freud really put a lot of emphasis on internal struggles and conflicts. And so by the time Jung was, an older man, he had really kind of shifted his theories, we'll say, away from Freudian psychodynamics and into his own kind of field of psychodynamics. So Carl Jung is famous for the collective unconscious. That's kind of the phrase that you see associated with him on tests. But he also is this idea of narrative. So one of the kind of underknown things about Carl Jung, I don't think Myers talks about it in your book very much, is that Carl Jung not only deviated away from Freud's theory in the childhood conflicts, but he also deviated because Freud rejected this idea that Jung was starting to theorize the purpose of religion, right? Freud was Hebrew-born, he was Jewish by ethnicity, but he was an atheist. He was similar to Nietzsche in his idea of nihilism. And Friedrich Nietzsche, you might remember from the beginning of the year, was this German nihilist. He created this idea that everything is kind of meaningless in the grand scheme of things. There's no karma. In fact, Nietzsche famously made this phrase that God is dead, right? And really what he meant by that was not that God was alive and he lived in Seattle and then he died of old age. It was more the idea that the concept of God had died in the Enlightenment era. Basically, Nietzsche believed that organized religion disappeared on a grand scale with the Age of Enlightenment. And Nietzsche was not praising that. Friedrich Nietzsche actually was lamenting the idea that people ran away from religion in Europe after the Age of Enlightenment because he believed that religion was good for society. It's kind of ironic because he was an atheist, but he believed that the narrative of religion and mythology and tradition is what kept people cooperative and pro-social. So Nietzsche famously predicted, well, God is dead, and now millions of people will die violent deaths as a result of it. And he's right. But it's also worth noting that millions of people have been killed in the name of religion as well. But Nietzsche was one of those nihilists that it's very, very depressing to read about, right? Everything is meaningless. It doesn't matter what you do. So all of your actions might as well be self-serving. So that's a significant belief system, right, in colonial America and Western Europe in the 1780s and the early 1800s. And now here we find ourselves in Freud's day in the turn of the century in the 1900s, and he's studying what drives behavior. And Carl Jung after him, right, they both traveled to America together at one point to attend this seminar at a university. And so there's photos of Jung and Freud together and a lot of academic discussions that they had. Freud published over 40 books in his lifetime. Jung published several books in his lifetime, right? So they're both huge contributors to psychodynamics. And then you kind of deviate a little bit with Viktor Frankl. Viktor Frankl, we won't get into as much detail, but I think that he doesn't get his due credit for helping as many people as he did. Viktor Frankl wrote probably maybe one of the top 5 or top 10 most influential psychology books of all time, with Man's Search for Meaning. So that's the book that I told you. If you read nothing else in this school year other than the textbook, read Man's Search for Meaning, because Man's Search for Meaning is kind of a 2-part book. The opening part of it is Frankl's biography, the account of what his experience was like in a Nazi concentration camp. But the second half of the book was where he published his theory, his clinical practice of logotherapy. So he comes up with this theory while he's almost very literally while he was at Auschwitz. Right? He had kind of had this thought process beforehand, and he wrote it all down because he was worried the SS was going to take it away from him, and they did. And so he had to kind of reformulate this plan. And the whole time that he was incarcerated in a concentration camp, he had this thought that if I can get out of here, this is how I'm going to help people. And that's kind of how his theory blossomed. So Frankl was this idea of logotherapy, that if there is purpose in your suffering, then you can find a way to survive that, right? So if you misunderstand Frankl's book, you walk away thinking, wow, Frankl is saying that unless you suffer immensely, your life has no meaning. And that's not what he means. He means that if your life has purpose, then when you suffer, even immensely, like suffering at the hands of Nazis who are trying to exterminate your race, so when you suffer, you can find purpose in that. You can find meaning in that, and you can use that as something on which to base your life. And if you can't see, so Viktor Frankl died in 1997, right? So he lived a very long life, but it kind of brings it into perspective that your life and his life almost overlapped. That's how close we are to Nazi persecution and concentration camps and genocide. Is really, really, really not ancient history. It's kind of brings it close to home. But all 3 of these figures were affected in some way by Adolf Hitler because of the time period that they lived. In fact, Freud lived in Vienna until 1933 when Hitler's elected. There's kind of some writing on the wall, some anti-Semitism, right? Freud is Jewish born, and so by 1935 you have the Nuremberg race laws, which identify what is a Jew and what is not a Jew. The German term of Mischling, like this like racial denotation. And then by 1935, 1936-ish, you have these festivals where the Nazi SA or the brown shirts are burning books in mass that don't align with the Third Reich. And so Sigmund Freud is one of those authors who was very much rejected by Hitler and Nazism. And he was famously quoted as speaking to a colleague of his, and he made the comment that, look at the progress we've made as a society. If this were medieval times, they would be burning me, and now at least they're content with burning my books. And so that's a hell of an optimism to have when somebody is trying to eliminate your race of people. So by 1938, most of Freud's children, I think he had a son and a daughter. Anna was his daughter. He had a son and a grandson. They had left Austria, and then Anschluss happens, the annexation of Austria, and Freud finally leaves. So very literally, near the last year of his life, after living in Austria his whole life, he flees Austria and he goes to London. So he died in London in September of 1939, and a lot of the things that he had sort of theorized and written down were not published until after he died. In fact, some of his theories of the psychosexual stages and things like that were published under Anna's name, Anna Freud, his daughter, even though they were his theories, because she found them. He wasn't really ready to expose them to public consumption, but she published them because she wanted his theories and thoughts to live on. So I think some of the criticism of Freud might be fair, but it might be accurate, but it may not be fair. Let's say that, because it was never Freud's intention for him to indoctrinate the world with his thoughts. He was processing what he believed to be possibly the case, and obviously Freud was a flawed human being, like most people are. So we can't romanticize him as a contributor. But I think the relevance of his theory still stands to today. So let's kind of jump into psychodynamics. If you break down the word, psyche obviously meaning mind, and dynamics meaning the parts of or the components of. So psychodynamics a lot of times is used interchangeably with the word psychoanalysis. They're both Freudian terms. So if you see psychodynamics in a question, it's probably Freud or a neo-Freudian. If you see psychoanalysis, it's definitely Freud or a neo-Freudian. But psychodynamics is like it is the field of study, right? Psychoanalysis is more of a practice, right? The analyzing of the mind. Psychodynamics is the explanation of the breakdown of the mind. Now, if we compare that to our modern definition, let's look at the modern definition of personality. So this is like your vocab quiz definition, right? The definition according to the text or in modern explanations is this. Personality is our characteristic pattern of thinking, feeling, knowing, even sort of what drives our behavior. But that's kind of an incomplete definition because what affects how we feel? What affects how we think? What affects how we know? Is it culture? Is it environment? Nature or nurture? Does it change or is it continuous? Right? And when we look at personality traits that way, they become a lot more complex. Right? In fact, there's a few personality profiles that have kind of come out of this idea of how do we measure someone's personality. We measure it in traits. Right? So personality is not one thing, it's a combination of things. And there are different theories on personality. Right? In fact, to go back to Carl Jung believed there were two types of personality. He believed there was the introvert and the extrovert. That was his theory. He came up with this idea that some people are outgoing and some people are like reserved. So what's significant about that is that's the foundations, the original two personality traits that became the Myers-Briggs personality type indicator, or the MBTI. And so if you take Myers-Briggs, there's really 16 different personalities because it's a combination of 4 traits, right? And basing that on Carl Jung's original introversion versus extroversion. Then there are other ones other than Myers-Briggs. And Myers-Briggs is great for compatibility profiles, things like eHarmony, or what kind of job would you fit well in. And there's a lot of things about your personality type that you can get from the Myers-Briggs type indicator. But there's another one that I want you to write down that we'll get into later on in the chapter. But that's what's known as the Big Five. The Big Five personality trait test or indicator. The Big Five. And it's the same 5 traits, but I've seen the acronym 2 different ways. Sometimes it's listed as ocean, and sometimes it's listed as canoe, right? Ocean or canoe. So if you write that down, ocean or canoe, whatever order that you like, there are 5 personality trait scales, right, according to this particular theorist. And the idea here is that where you fall in any one of these traits, it's a sliding spectrum, is going to indicate a lot about you. And the reason why I'm bringing that up now, kind of pausing from Freud, is that when you look at the Big Five personality traits, that's a lot better predictor, right? Myers-Briggs is a great kind of explainer. It's a great like compatibility match, and it tells you a lot about who you are as a person and maybe kind of the things that make you tick. But ocean or canoe, the Big Five personality traits, takes a little bit different angle. It's a great predictor of certain things, so it's a predictive validity type of test. For instance, the O stands for openness, right, in ocean or canoe. Let's just do ocean. We'll start with the O. The O stands for openness. Openness as in how open-minded are you as a person. The opposite of openness, if you score high in openness, that means you are open to new things. You would be more likely to take on new challenges or move to a new city or go to a college that's way far away from home or, jump out of an airplane or, do something that's scary. You might be more open to new experiences. If you score low in the openness scale, that means that you're kind of closed-minded. That matters when it comes to psychodynamics because when you look at the cross-sectional studies, people who score high in the openness category of the Big Five, they lean more towards psychoanalysis. In fact, it's not even so much that they can agree with psychoanalysis and psychodynamics, it's that they actually have more vivid dreams when they sleep. And they remember more details of their dreams. And they're more likely to find this latent underlying meaning in their dreams. So people who score higher on the openness scale of the Big Five personality traits, they tend to buy into psychoanalysis and psychodynamics. Those Freudian people, the same people that tend to buy into astrological predictions or signs from the universe. And so some people they don't rank very high on the openness scale. And it's not just do they reject the theories, it's also that their dreams are less vivid. They're more summarized. They happen in clips and not full, narratives. And so when you see people in certain fields, you tend to be able to predict them. So doctors and lawyers tend to score lower on the openness scale of the big 5 personality traits. They're very black and white people. So when doctors and lawyers go to therapy, statistically speaking, it's not as beneficial for them. They're not as open to the therapeutic process. And so this tells us a lot about yourself, because that takes some pressure off. You're like, well, therapy doesn't work for me. Well, you may not be as open as a person. I don't score very high on the openness scale. I don't like to think of myself as a closed-minded person, but on the big 5 personality traits, I'm just not as open. It's not one of my higher scores. Conscientiousness, which is the C, I do score high in conscientiousness, not astronomically higher. Now, conscientiousness is a term that refers to like how responsible are you as a person, which is comical and ironic to me because I've not historically always been a very responsible person. I was a very mediocre student, and the reason for that was because what I called laziness or apathy, but I now recognize as a lack of conscientiousness. So males tend to score lower in conscientiousness in their teenage years, but tend to catch up to their female counterparts by the time they're in adulthood, right? So ladies, you got that going for you. That's a good thing. These lazy slobs will figure it out, right? But it's a good thing. It's a good thing because you're at the stage of your life where you don't have a ton of responsibility, so you can afford to learn conscientiousness the hard way. So how do we use the C, the conscientiousness, to predict? People who are conscientious are great academic students, not because they're more intelligent, but because they are responsible. They study when they have tests, they organize their time, they prioritize things. If you were like me, when I was a teenager, I scored low in conscientiousness, so I was waiting till the last minute. I was a procrastinator. I wasn't organized. I was losing things all the time, and it caused me unnecessary stress because I wasn't with it. Now, here's an interesting thought about conscientiousness. In the United States and Western market economies, really, because it's Canada and Germany and places like that as well, the number one predictor of wealth is intelligence. Well, that's kind of a bummer because that's mostly genetic. And that's unavoidable because intelligent people are going to rise to the top of society as long as they are allowed to compete, because you want to exploit the intelligent people to solve the complex problems. Right? You don't want me solving the COVID crisis. You don't want me coming up with the vaccine or something like that, because I just don't have the intelligence to tackle that problem. No, we want to exploit the creative genius of intelligent people. And so the number one predictor of wealth in a Western society is intelligence. But guess what the number 2 predictor of wealth is? It's conscientiousness. It's people who score high in the trait of conscientiousness, which means, and this is something you can work on, if you are organized, responsible, accountable human being, you can do very well financially in your life. Lots of intelligent people don't make money, but most conscientious people do, right? So that's the good news. You may not be able to increase your intelligence, but you can become really responsible, right? So while the openness applies more to psychodynamics, to go down the whole list of the big 5, conscientiousness is the C. The E is where we get into kind of Carl Jung. That's extraversion. Extraversion. Right? Extraversion meaning you are outgoing as a person. It doesn't mean that you're obnoxious, although some extroverted people are so extroverted it's obnoxious. It means that you're comfortable in social settings. And if you were to use the big 5 for like a romantic partner, it's not the best one for that. Myers-Briggs is probably better, or the DISC profile. But if you were to use big 5, you could have compatible people, one of which scores high in extroversion and one of which scores low, which would mean they were introverted. That's not a deal breaker for a relationship, because you could have an extroverted female and an introverted male, and they walk into a social setting. One of them is comfortable in the social scenario, they're a social butterfly, the other one is not. But they can make it work because that's not a competing trait, we'll say. Now, the O, being open-mindedness, you probably want to find somebody that's similar in open-mindedness as you. Because if not, you're always going to be doing things by yourself. If you're like, oh, hey, yeah, let's go skydiving. Nope. Okay, so that you're jumping out of a plane all by yourself or with a friend. And again, it's not a deal breaker, but these are things that you should know before you commit to a person long term. What personality traits do you line up in, and which personality traits do you not line up in? And are they compatible? Right? Introverted and extroverted people might be fine together because it's compatible. Yes? I do in some traits. I believe opposites attract in some traits. Like, I'm an extrovert, my wife's an introvert, and it works fine because if we're in social settings, she is actually very uncomfortable making small talk with strangers. I'm not. So for her, that allows her to kind of like stay in the shadows and not be acknowledged. As so horrible as that sounds. She does not want attention. Even when it's like her birthday, she just doesn't tell people because she doesn't want attention. That's just how she is. She's very comfortable in a much, 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 much less social setting. She's introverted. So in that way, we are complementary. So opposites attract. If we were both extroverted, maybe it would work. I don't know. But in openness, maybe you want to have the same level of openness. Because what if it's not your willingness to jump out of an airplane and do adventurous things? What if it's your, like, open-mindedness when it comes to other points of view? Well, if you have a really open-minded partner and a really closed-minded partner, they may collide a little bit. So I would tend to think that openness is probably one that you want to score the same or similar in. Extroversion and introversion is not a deal breaker. But let's look at the A. The A is agreeableness, right? How well do you get along with people? So what if your boyfriend or girlfriend is a jerk and everyone hates them? Uh-oh, that's a problem. So if you're not very agreeable, that means you're abrasive. You butt heads with people. People don't get along with you, or you don't get along with them, and they don't like you. That's a problem. But if you're too agreeable, then you're like a sycophant, right? Or a sycophant, I guess is how you pronounce that. Like you're just trying to please everyone, right? The whole idea is that you're going to avoid conflict because you don't want people to disagree. Almost like a brown noser. You're just going to go along with what everyone says. So being too agreeable makes you a pushover, right? In fact, when they look at studies of people in private sector jobs, extroverted people get promoted more often and they make more money. And you say, well, that's unfair. Well, no, it's correlations, not causations, but this is what happens. Extroverted people not only network better than introverts, but they also ask for raises and promotions. Agreeable people also get promoted more, but there's a limit to that. Once you get past the level of agreeableness that people become a pushover, they're too afraid of displeasing their boss, so they never ask for a raise. Most business schools will teach you, it's a common fact, that if you work in a private sector job, about every 2 years you need to go to your boss, sit down with the numbers and say, I deserve a raise, because they won't voluntarily give you one. And most people just don't think that you can ask for a raise. And if you have leverage, it works. You're like, okay, well, there's another company that's willing to pay me 10%, but I'm happy here. Can you match that? But agreeable people don't always ask for raises because they don't want to rock the boat, right? Introverted people don't always ask for raises because they're afraid of the social, to bring up the conversation. So in a business setting, extroverts make more money. Not because they're extroverts, but because they create more opportunities for themselves. Agreeable people make more money because people like them. They get along with them, right? But if they're too agreeable, then they don't even ask. They don't even bother, right? So we have openness as opposed to being closed-minded. We have conscientiousness as to being disorganized in a trash can fire. I don't know what the opposite of conscientiousness is, right? You have extraversion, which is as opposed to being introverted. You have agreeableness as opposed to being a jerk. I don't know, like disagreeable, I guess would be the opposite. And then that brings us to the end, which is neuroticism. What it means to be neurotic is like panic to the level of paranoia, right? Let's assume for the sake of argument that being neurotic is an example of anxiety. So whatever the opposite of anxiety is, that's the opposite of neuroticism. So people who worry about things that they can't control, that's neuroticism. You're being neurotic. You're looking for things to be wrong. You're always in a panic mode. That's another one of those, to her question, that if you have two neurotic people in a relationship, you're probably just going to disintegrate into a pile of ashes on the floor, right? It's probably not good to have two panicked, stressed out people, right? So I have close friends and some acquaintances, and there's a couple couples that I can think of off the top of my head where there are two neurotic people in a relationship, and it is chaotic and stressful to even be around them. You guys know what I'm talking about, right? You know, when you're like around people and like everything is on fire, and you're just like, let me help you, right? Let me get out of this situation is what you're thinking. So two neurotic people in a relationship is like a dumpster fire, right? Everyone's panicking, and then the other person is panicking because their partner is panicking, which just adds to the collective panic. If you're a neurotic person, that's fine. Find someone who's not. Find someone who can mellow you out. Not someone who is the opposite of that, who's like apathetic and doesn't care about anything, right? But find someone who's a good complementary personality trait for you. Yes. Yeah. It could, yeah. Assuming that you don't regulate it or get help, yeah, it could. In fact, that's now we get back into kind of some Freudian topics here. Is Freud's theories on depression and anxiety were really not too far off base. The difference is that Freud didn't have the benefit of neurobiology, right? Understanding, serotonic systems and things like that. I mean, they knew that they existed, but they really didn't fully understand how integrated your chemicals are. And we'll talk about that in the Rockstar Manifesto, right? How to manipulate your brain chemistry. Because you can cause yourself to stay sad, or you can bring yourself kind of out of that. Now, I'm not talking about clinical depression where it's irrational. I'm talking about people who get depression because their spirit is broken, which happens. Frankl saw that. Frankl in his book talks about how in the concentration camps, they could predict which people were about to die because they had lost all hope. They had given up. In other words, their spirit was broken, right? They had lost their will to live. So Freud talks a lot about that as emotional damage. And here's what Freud realized. From treating World War I patients, Freud realized that the mind is very medical. In fact, Freud was being rejected as non-science and pseudoscience, and people were making fun of the fact that he was not really a medical doctor anymore. But what Freud found out is what we now know. The mind is as important as the body, and it could be more important. Because Freud came up with theories for things like the life instinct and the death instinct. So here's a good phrase to think about for Freud. At the essence of all of Freud's theories is a conflict of some kind, a struggle. So if you write down the word conflict, that's going to help you, because if you see conflict in a test question, it's probably referring to Freud. So definitely read the question all the way through to make sure. But, for instance, there's this conflict of good versus evil, chaos versus order, life versus death, and that's constantly at play in your biology. You're like, wow, that's deep. And don't worry, we're going to get deep. But Freud is like, this is not a constant awareness battle that you have. This is the animalistic biology that you share, right? So Freud believed that I don't think he used this term, but he believed the curse of man was conscious awareness, right? That when we were animals, we were blissfully unaware of the morals of our decisions, right? So let's say, for instance, you have like this death instinct. Freud calls it thanatos, right? So thanatos is the death instinct. This is very circle of life stuff. Like, I had this thought this morning, and I'll explain it to you this way. Why would animals and humans have this instinctive drive to take life? Well, because you can't live unless something else dies. You probably never thought about that, right? So, unless that pig dies, you don't get to eat. So the very purpose of that pig's life is part of the ecosystem of which you are the apex. You are the apex predator. You are the top, right? So Jung talks about narratives and mythology, this idea that religion and mythology all has a similar narrative, that there is like these archetypes, right? You have this, this idea that there is the king or the head of the state, and there are the peasants, and there's this patriarchy or this hierarchy, right? That's a narrative that you just biologically understand. It's a metaphor that you just get. You look at the animal kingdom. There's no stress or sleep lost for the lion who kills the gazelle. The lion, it's the famous quote, the lion doesn't consider the will of the gazelle. The lion doesn't worry about the gazelle. He instinctively devours the gazelle. In fact, the only reason for the gazelle is so that the lion can eat. right? So you don't get to live unless something else dies. You're immediately impacted by the death of something else. And you're like, I can't handle that. I become a vegan. What about the plants? Okay, maybe that's a little bit far. But in that sense, something has to be killed and taken out of the ecosystem so that you can ingest it and it keeps you a part of the ecosystem. So Freud believed in this thanatos death instinct that you have, this destructive desire that was unconscious. And for the most part, it's probably okay because you can keep it in check with the life instinct. And the life instinct he stole from this Greek passion, erotic, sexual desire called eros, where we get the word erotic. It's this almost like aggressive, violent, sexual lust. So I don't know why that's what he called the life instinct. Probably had to do with procreation. The idea that the life instinct is self-preserving. So if you, let's say for instance there's a struggle between thanatos and eros, and you're like, I'm well. Let's say there's a struggle between, do I be destructive in this moment, or do I preserve life in this moment? If eros wins out, you're not destructive. If thanatos wins out, you're destructive, which might mean you hurt someone else, you kill an animal, you blow up a building, you burn something down out of anger or rage, or, as Freud found out, sometimes people's death instinct can be inward. Sometimes they can be self-destructive and harmful, which is Freud's explanation for suicide. That people, they have this death instinct, and that when they go through trauma, the death instinct is winning. And they lose their desire to live, the preservation of life. So it's very deep, and it's hard to kind of stomach, but then the more you chew on it, you're like, okay, I can get behind that. It's not really what I would call it, right? Because that's what Freud is. Freud is just explaining things that he observes. Right? He's not predicting anything. He's giving it a name. He's personifying things, right? So at the essence of this is a struggle. It's a conflict. Life and death, order and chaos, animalism and human awareness. Without human awareness, we have no guilt, we have no shame, we have no anxiety. We just have instinct and action. Instinct and action, and that's how animals live their life. If you were an animal, you would be completely self-serving. So even Kohlberg, much later than Freud, commented on that. Like, well, why do you feel bad about harming someone? Because you have this conscious awareness that they have feelings too. If the lion all of a sudden became consciously aware that the gazelle were an entity, then it would feel bad and stop eating the gazelle. In fact, the mere notion that we can decide to opt out of eating meat entirely points to how consciously aware we are. Because if we were instinctive animals, there would be no second thought. The food source, it runs from me. I catch it, I kill it, I eat it. There's no like, well, that little bunny has a bunny wife and little bunny babies back at the den that it lives in. And you know, somebody's going to be without their bunny father, and they're going to grow up with an electric complex and become like a stripper. And no, that doesn't take place in the lion's mind, right? Because it's just completely animalistic. So in that sense, Freud would say thanatos is the desire that wins in the animal kingdom. It's death and destruction. And death wins. It's survival of the fittest. It's Darwinism. If I'm stronger than you and I want to eat you, I will. Come at me. That's the animalistic nature, and it's very violent. But Freud believes, like a lot of people, like Jung and other theorists, that that's what we evolved from. That's what we came out of. We have this animalistic side to us. The difference is Freud calls it the unconscious. Excuse me. The unconscious. The unconscious mind is what we're not aware of. You have to tap into the unconscious urges that you have. How do you do that? Free association. So that's where we get into this idea. So we're trying to hit some vocab here, where you get this idea where Freud wants his clinical practice and his therapy to be about healing his clients, his patients. In fact, he called them patients, right? The whole idea is that this is a medical condition. So you have people who have psychological distress, what we now know as anxiety or something like that. So he has, this couch or this chaise lounge, which is now the image that we have of psychoanalysis, this like old guy who's sitting there with a clipboard behind you, writing down, you talking about your mother. But it was very important to Freud that the patient and the doctor not be face to face. He didn't want it to be an intimidating, I'm going to fix you kind of a dynamic. He wanted to create an environment that was comfortable and safe and relaxing so that people would free associate. Free associate means saying whatever comes into your mind, even if it's random and nonsensical. Because what Freud believed is that you have things trapped in your unconscious awareness, and it's trying to get out. And the real essence of therapy, according to Freud, was we have to find these problematic conflicts deep below the surface, bring them into light, which are painful, so that we can address them, right? Because think about, what is anxiety really? You're like, I'm afraid to go to school. Well, why? You're not afraid the building is going to fall on you and kill you. You wouldn't be afraid to go to school if there were no people in it. So are you really afraid of going to school? No. You're afraid of something else unconscious, which you're anticipating is going to happen when you're at that place. That's what therapy does, is to find that deep-rooted trigger so that you can address it and it's not unconscious anymore, right? That's the essence of psychoanalysis. Free association. He even tried hypnosis, this idea that he's hypnotizing people. Well, why? He wants to distract their conscious guard, right? You protecting yourself by being emotionally guarded, so that you can tap into the hidden unconscious forces that are causing you trauma, right? So to understand the unconscious mind, you have to look at the metaphor that he uses. He uses the metaphor of an iceberg to describe your mind. So Freud believes there are 3 levels to consciousness. There are the things that you are consciously aware of. You're thinking about them right now. Lunch, right? Lyrics to a song. What you're going to do tomorrow when you don't have school, right? Oh crap, you have a math quiz. Those are your conscious thoughts. They're in your awareness. But then he believed there's a level below that, right? Your memories and things like that. Those are things you're not currently thinking about, but you could easily retrieve them. He calls that the pre-conscious mind. You even see that in like sports psychology. Like, I'm not thinking about this, but I'm really stressed. Why am I stressed? Well, there's some pre-conscious, and that's things like your stored knowledge, your memories, right? So there's some song that you definitely know the lyrics to, but you don't even remember it because you're not thinking about it right now in your conscious mind. But if you hear it on the radio, it's going to go from the pre-conscious level to the conscious level, and then you'll just start jamming out, right? Because it's in there, right? You have access to it. And this, I can't overstate it enough, even though it's kind of strange to think about. The unconscious mind is literally that. It's not possible for you to even comprehend what it is that you have deep in the dark corners of your brain. And that's why some people reject it. They're like, no. But that's the point. You don't even know that you have the ability, right? So here's a modern example of Freud's unconscious level mind. This is the hot-cold empathy gap. This is the idea that when you're sitting here nice and calm and relaxed in a homeostatic state, you can't accurately predict just how violent you're capable of. Just how much violence, I should say. We're all Ted Bundy, right? We're all just one step away from that. Look at Viktor Frankl. He saw people that went into the concentration camps and it broke them. And they became monstrous. He saw other people, it broke them and they gave up and they died. And then he saw some people who were heroic. And he talks about that in his book, Man's Search for Meaning. He said, look for the heroes. When you go through trauma, look for the heroes. And that's an example of like terrorist attacks and things like that. And you're like, well, that's terrifically optimistic, but maybe it's not pragmatic. So let me give you some perspective on that. I saw this and I thought it was pretty profound, so I by no means came up with this. I'm stealing it. But I read this little anecdote that said, like, maybe 2020 you think is like the worst year that you've ever endured. Maybe it's the opposite of that. Maybe it's the best year that you've ever endured. Viktor Frankl would say so, right? All of this stuff, COVID shutdowns and lockdowns and mental health problems and, eating your weight in candy and doing nothing that has any sort of meaning to it. And then, it changes the course of your school year and Hurricane Sally hits and throws everything for a curveball and sports are affected and all these things are changed and the weird, crazy election, it just keeps going and going and going and going. And you're like, dear Lord, right? But the optimistic viewpoint, or the Viktor Frankl, the logotherapy viewpoint of 2020 is, what if it's not the worst year you've ever endured? What if it's actually the best, most beneficial year you've ever endured? Because why? Why would it be a good thing that you've gone through all of this craziness? I mean, let's think about this logically. You went through all of those things and more, and yet here you freaking sit. It didn't break you. It built resilience in you. And yeah, it sucks because you learned some things that you didn't want to know. You'd much rather have an easy senior year You're entitled to that. It's not fair that you don't get it, and those are true statements. But the reality is, it's building something in you, right? That's why you're supposed to move away when you get out of high school. Challenge yourself to learn what you're capable of. Build some resiliency. And that's what Freud believed. Freud believed unless you're put in a situation where you're forced to tap into this unconscious mind, you don't even know what's in there. So if you want to get into the deep, dark, like annals and corners of your brain, then you have to hypnotize someone. Or participate in free association exercises. And Freud progressed even past that. He wrote probably the most famous psychology book ever written. And if you read one of over 40 books that Freud wrote, read The Interpretation of Dreams. The Interpretation of Dreams is where Freud lays out this idea that if you want to get into the unconscious mind of people, well, dreams are the pathway to the unconscious mind. And even the psychoanalytic tradition of looking for, let me give you 2 vocab words. When you wake up from a dream, the events and the details that you remember from the dream, the story of the dream, the narrative, those are called the manifest content of the dream. The manifest content. So Freud says, you're going to tell me the manifest details of the story that you just witnessed before you woke up. Tell me what your dream was about. That's the manifest content. But the psychoanalyst like Freud says, I'm going to pull some hidden meaning out of that. The symbolism. What does it stand for? That's the latent content of the dream. The latent content, or dormant content, is the underlying symbolic meaning of the dream. That's the latent content. So for instance, I'll give you an example. In the psychoanalytic tradition, according to Freud, there are certain symbolism in dreams that you just get from the unconscious. One of those is water. So if you have a dream where you're drowning, well, the manifest story is, I was drowning in my dream, and that sucks. But the psychoanalyst would say, well, water represents some kind of transformation, right? And if you're like me, that's hard for you to imagine. I don't know how much I buy into dream interpretation, but I know there's something there, right? But let's say for the sake of argument that it's real. Let's say for the sake of argument that you can interpret dreams. And so you have some like dream about you drowning in water when you go to your therapist, and your therapist tells you, well, the water is not really that you're dying. The water is that you're going through some like transformative process right now. And that can help you cope, right? And if that's true, if there's some kind of symbolism that's just manifest in the universe, and you can dig through it and figure out what the latent content is, it could help you, right? Because now it's not like a death wish where I'm drowning myself in my sleep. It's like, well, no, my hidden psyche is trying to encourage me a little bit. I mean, again, I don't know how much you buy into that, but that's just one example of symbolism. Like, water is very symbolic in dream interpretation. Mm-hmm. Yes, that's the goal of hypnosis. The goal of hypnosis, the reason why it works is because you can distract people's guard. And when you're tired, you're unguarded, right? When you're intoxicated, you're unguarded. So what are you saying? You're saying how you really feel. And that's what Freud wants. Freud would want someone in a tired, exhausted state. Not intentionally put them there, but they make better therapy clients because now, without you trying to protect and defend yourself, not physically, obviously, you're going to be honest. And that's the point of free association. When you're in that tired state, I'm just going to start asking you questions, and you just start talking about randomness. And they're like, it inevitably lands on their parents won't let them do anything, or their peers are whatever, and there's your thread, and you start pulling on that thread, and basically you get the heart of the issue, right? So all of this is centered around conflicts, and the idea of being tired, being distracted, being hypnotized is so that you get out of your own way, and then we can get into your subconscious mind. So yes, tired people make great psychoanalytic, let's say tired people make great free associators, right? Because you're just spouting off whatever's in your mind, and it might be nonsensical, but it's in there, right? It's whatever's in your brain. Right, so that's the unconscious mind. Now let's look at the personality trio here. Freud created a persona for 3 different parts of the personality. Right? He believed that you were an ego. That's who you are. The ego is I, egocentrism and egotistical. Right? That's who you are. That is the executor of your will. That is the decider of what you will do. The ego is the executive. But it's also known as the reality principle. Because it's rational. Let me give you an example. So if we have an ego, which is the executive of deciding how to make our desires a reality, right? So for instance, the id is what's known as the pleasure principle. The id, think of it as if it were ID, instinctive drives or instinctive desires. So Freud believed that sometimes your instinctive desires were problematic, right? So here's an example of an implicit drive that's not problematic. Hunger. You're not going to see a psychological conflict in the fact that you wanted to eat, so you did, right? It's not going to cause you any psychological distress. But your sexual desires and your aggressive drives might. Because what would happen if you suppress your sexuality? It doesn't just evaporate and disappear. It manifests itself in some unhealthy way, right? If you have dysfunctional sexual relationships as a child, Freud says, they're going to manifest themselves as dysfunctional sexual acts as an adult, right? So that deep, dark sexual aggression, right, where is it? Violent motives, unacceptable sexual desires, those are going to manifest themselves if left unchecked. So the idea here is to stay balanced and healthy. And here's what the ego has to do. The role of the ego, according to Freud, is to determine, do we listen to our instinctive drives or do we listen to our sense of right and wrong? Here's the difference between the id and the superego. The id is genetic. It's animalistic. It's built into your DNA. But morality is subjective. That's based on your culture. That's based on your learning. So if you look at, we take away the superego side of things, right? Okay, I guess I can't. Take away, we'll just go with the arrow, right? What if you were an animal? What if you were the lion? You don't feel morally conflicted about attacking the gazelle. Why? Because you don't have a moral system. You're not conflicted. Therefore, no psychological trauma. Animals are not aware. They can't suffer guilt or anxiety because they don't have guilt. To have guilt, you have to feel that you violated a moral norm. And that's why the id, the ego, and superego is pretty significant. So Freud believes as you grow, your animalistic desires don't change, but your sense of right and wrong do. So think like Superman or a superhero, right? What does Superman does good things, right? Superego is you trying to do the moral right thing. So I'll give you an example. The reality principle is sometimes people overthink it. The reality principle, like your ego doesn't have a stance in the fight. It's just deciding which influence to give into, right? All right, we'll pick this up after we take our quiz.